Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on the policies and politics of open data. My name's Jane Dudman. I'm from The Guardian. I edit our Public Leaders Network, which is our online resource for public managers of all public services. And of course, in the context of open data, I can never not mention my beloved colleagues up on the Guardian data blog. Simon Rogers is in fact our hero. So we've been writing an awful lot about open data and of course the Open Government Partnership over the past little while. This session is to talk about policies and politics of open data, as it says. And the format is that we're going to have a very short introduction from each of our panelists, and then we're going to open it right up to the floor and just have a debate about this topic, which I'm sure will provide some ebb and flow. So the real thing about open government is that it seems now to be everywhere. Everybody has, in fact, jumped on the bandwagon, and some very, very big claims are made for open data. I suppose when it really moved out of the niche and into the big time was with the setting up of the Open Government Partnership in September 2011, and with the first OGP conference in Brasilia in April last year. You could really see national governments taking open data and transparency very, very seriously. And the big claims are made for it. Francis Maud, for example, boldly says that data is the raw material of the 21st century. There are two things, I suppose. There's internal government use, there's transparency and efficiency, making government itself, making governments themselves more transparent and efficient. And there's also the use of more open data to actually fuel new economies, particularly important at this time. But the issue that we want to kind of tease out today is who are the winners and who are the losers in that situation? What's the real driver for more open data? Is transparency on its own enough? That's enough from me. We've got four fantastic speakers to open our session. We're going to begin with Dominique Lazanski from the Taxpayers Alliance. Dominique's done extensive work on internet regulation, net neutrality and government regulation online, her particular specialities. We're then going to move to Paul. Paul Maltby is here from the Cabinet Office. He's the Director of Transparency and Open Data. He's got background in central government, but he's also worked in local government with a secondment in Leicestershire. So he's had an interesting overview of various different parts of government. Then we'll move to, now just come in, Tim, T-I before O. See, I can do this. Tim Davies, who's from the University of Southampton, and who's the founder of Practical Participation. And he's an activist and thinker on the interface really between technology, open government, and I think it's fair to say social justice. So that's Tim's. He's also representing civil society in the OGP. And then finally, we'll come to Tom, who is a Canadian, although born in Scotland.
No, born in Salford.
Salford, can't read.
Close.
Yeah. and Tom does interesting work on the intersection of technology, politics, and economics, and has written the book No One Makes You Shop at Walmart. That was your book, wasn't it? Based on game theory. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So a fantastic panel. Enough from me. We're going to begin with Dominique.
With me, yes, I get the unfortunate position. So I'm on the panel mostly because I sit on the Open Data User Group, and that is in the Cabinet Office. It's supported by a number of people in Paul's team, chaired by Heather Savory, and we I basically represent civil society, so activists, anybody you can think of from Open Rights Group all the way down to local activists, and also charity groups as well. So we advise the government on what should be opened, and our advice is taken to the Data Strategy Board. And we can talk a little bit more about this, hopefully, throughout the panel, but I just wanted to highlight that sort of my background and the role that I'm playing today. I'm just going to offer three thoughts about the politics and maybe even the policies of open data from a personal perspective, so outside of the open data user group. First of all, it's been quite clear to me in all the policy work I've done, but in particular in the policy work I do in open data, that the speed of government moves very slowly compared to the speed of developers or open data community or whatever it might be. And still, on a day-to-day basis, and I'm not putting you down, Paul, but still I find that a real challenge because, living online and being online and communicating online, I want things right now and I want to be able to use things immediately. And so just highlighting that because it's become still very evident through the work on the open data user group. More importantly, from a personal perspective, I still think that more data needs to be open more quickly, and more government-held data that's paid for by the taxpayer should be open and made available under the open government license as soon as possible. As you may or may not know, at the Open Data User Group, we've been looking at trading funds and trying to understand what's behind them and get any kind of idea of budgets and things like that. But there are a lot of other opportunities for opening up data and data streams that are not hampered by issues like privacy as well as trading fund disclosure. So that's also something that I just wanted to highlight here. It's a frustration I have and goes hand in hand with the speed of government. And finally, just to close, the other thing I'd like to point out, and again, from a personal perspective, is that I know, and probably all of you know well enough, that just opening up data is not enough. It's about the metadata, it's about the skills, it's about all of the other things that come with opening up data. And so I'm keenly aware of that, and we are keenly aware of that on the Open Data User Group. And we know that it's just not about opening up data. So I'm going to stop there because hopefully that'll highlight some things.
Thanks, Dominique. Cool.
Okay, thank you. I mean, my starting point for this is just to note that we're in the middle of, at the start of perhaps, a massive data revolution. We've got big data analytics, you've got linked data, you've got Internet of Sensors or Things, and open data is one part of that revolution that I think is going to transform how we live and how we work over the next decade. There are those who say this is a bit like the start of the internet, we're having our sort of 1995 moment. And I think that rings true for me. I think when we think about the politics of open data, then I think that in a funny way, the primary dimension isn't left, right, and Tory, Labour, Lib Dem, on that scale. But perhaps the primary dynamic is actually future past. And certainly, of course, there's politics involved in this, as there is in any decisions. But from where I sit, in that sort of hyper intense political cauldron around in Westminster, the world of open data is a relatively unfraught space in terms of the political dimension. I think many people just recognizing this is a change, open data is a change that is just going to happen, and people are largely aligned around that, though of course there's plenty of challenges. And what does government see as the benefits of open data? I think there's three things. There's economic growth, accountability of government, and also improved public services and citizen choice through that. On economic growth, I mean, we have in the UK some of the really right at the forefront of the world's data entrepreneurs. Plenty of countries come to see the Open Data Institute, in touch with the developers that we have in the UK. And it feels really exciting. This is like a really exciting moment in that creation of a new industry. Trying to calculate its worth is a fraught thing, and there's been previous attempts to do that, and there's some current, and I'm sure there'll be future ones. I just think the huge margin of error is trying to what was the value of the internet in 1995, what was the value of open GPS in the mid 80s. It's a hard thing to do, but it's a big number, and some say it could be an extraordinarily big number. I think the second benefit, thinking around government accountability, is something happens in government when things are open. And, I sort of put the question to you about, if you're thinking about, well, if you're paid for by the public purse and you thought, well, your travel expenses down here, your general expenses are available online, next to your name, next to your salary. I wonder whether you'd start to fill in those travel forms differently. Because I think I do, and I think others do. And I think there's the sense of actually there's something different and something going on there. I think the other thing is on the government accountabilities, it starts to open up different ways of doing policy, different dimensions here. And I think when we're looking at the use that some of the new organisations like Mastodon Sea has been making of their open prescribing data, and identifying these potential savings, up to £200 million or so of GPs moving from branded statins to generic statins. That sort of insight and knowledge, I just think the NHS is miles away from getting to that level of insight without that data being open and people being able to do that processing. So a long way away from realising that. The point is you've got the insight, now let's realise those benefits. But I think that has changed things. The third thing on public services, I think, we're all familiar with the bus apps and the rail apps and finding the next open available parking space. And sometimes actually the familiarity of that disguises the quite radical shift there's been in that front. And I think that's all very well, but I think the next big things for my money would be the equivalents in the more sophisticated, complex public services. So the thing that gives you a deep understanding as a citizen to think, okay, so what care home might I put my elderly parents in? What's really going on in my kids' school? And actually the deep experience for the citizen in that space in public services, I think, could be truly transformational, and you start to see some of the signs of that there. So that for me is a sense of the benefits. I think it's also worth thinking about the change in the process here. I don't want to sort of overplay that, because, in some ways government rumbles on, doesn't it? But there's something about being on Twitter and having the community, you and others, there, and feeling that real-time personal accountability scares the living daylights out of me. But also, it's thrilling, and there's something really different about that in my career as a civil servant. I'm clumsily, by the way, @_openp, but there's something different there, and I don't want to oversell it. But also this point about the Open Government Partnership. So we're currently devising an action plan for the UK as part of this, 58-country, relatively new effort on the international platform. And there's something about the way in which we're devising that with civil society. So things like parallel submissions to ministers from civil society, from officials, meeting at the Open Data Institute every Thursday to kind of go through. There's something, it sounds like a small thing, but there's something really different about that. And I think what's different about it is it's not just the normal set of government consultations. It's not that. But neither is it those sort of bogus, gimmicky things that, get done one day and then get sort of put. It doesn't feel like that to me. And so there's something about the process here that I do think is important. So I'm going to finish, but you'll note that I've sort of studiously avoided anything, hopefully, controversial or as a civil servant. I've been very careful with these things, but I do want to kind of provoke one point, which is that I think it's an irony. So I'm our Director of Open Data and Transparency, but it seems to me there's an irony in that the world of open data isn't that transparent unless you're a programmer, right? Thrilled to be the custodian of data.gov.uk at the moment. It's a wonderful resource and truly world leading, but it's blooming difficult to get your head around if you're not part of that community. And I think there's something here which is that we're dealing here with citizen power and potential citizen power as well as open data here. And I think a world that just speaks to a developer community and the public benefit is sort of second hand once you've had the development of applications is not enough. And I think I would like to see us taking that forward. So I think there's something too important here to just leave it to developers and programmers, though of course you are all wonderful.
Thank you very much, Paul. Tim.
So I'm going to try and approach this in two directions. One is to start with the politics of data itself and then go on to the politics of open data policy. So the important thing to recognise is data is constructed. Data sets govern our lives in many different ways. So the modern state is an assemblage of all sorts of data sets that have been designed at various points that really affect what policies can get made, how they're implemented, how they're directed, and that's significant. So Jeffrey Bowker talks about this in a book called Sorting Things Out, where he looks at the International Classification of Diseases, the list of things you can die from. And this is over 100 years old, revised every 10 years. But it's been shaped originally by the size of a sheet of A4. You can die from that many things, so there's not much space for tropical diseases, so we can't fund work on tropical diseases. And it's then been shaped by the various computer systems that's been put into over the years, first hierarchical databases and then relational databases, that still shape where we can flow funding in investigations of healthcare conditions and so on. So data sets themselves are political things, and there's a politics of data. Who gets to shape what goes in that data set? And that then gets interesting when we look at the politics of open data, because many of the open data sets we're calling for don't exist yet. They're being constructed as we open them. So local spending data, we've asked all local authorities to publish what they spend, and we've set the rule at £500 of political choice. And then we've developed standards for how that data should be represented, what it can be linked to. Again, technical and political choices all mixed up together that affect what we can do. So what goes into the data affects what comes out. So in the spend example, we've got a political decision to publish spend data, not results data. So decontextualised data on spending is great for certain advocacy organisations to pick up on and beat government up with, perhaps not looking at what's the results of that spending, what change is it bringing for people. So those apparent technical decisions are also political decisions. And so the way we do open data, I think, really matters. Now, politically, it could be a good moment. We move from data that's being defined and shaped inside government to data that we can contest and have conversations over. But we get a question, is data being opened up in a read-only way, that as citizens you can only access it, or is it being opened up in read-write ways where we can start contributing to and shaping data as well as just accessing it from government? And that latter form requires quite a big cultural change, or us to build other forms of institution outside of government that let us manage the data we need to run our societies. So there's a politics of data, and then open data policies themselves are also political. And we've seen open data, as Jane said, being pursued right around the world now, become quite a significant policy point for lots of governments. But it's being pursued for many different reasons. We've had lots of agendas mixed up in open data. We've had the public sector information agenda that we want economic growth and to exploit the commercial value. We've had a computerization movement, so we can make the state work more efficiently and more effectively if we have better data, often based on the idea that real innovation happens outside the state. So we're bypassing the attempt to transform the state to be more innovative by saying, let's just do that outside, and we're giving up on some of those tough problems in the way we do open data. And then we've got a transparency and accountability movement wanting to hold our governments to account. And it's interesting in Paul's title that's Director of Transparency and Open Data. Now, those two have been smashed together an awful lot, but they're very, very different things. You can have open data agendas that are purely about economic growth with no element of transparency in them, and in many countries that's what we're seeing, yet people are being able to play a rhetoric that we're being more transparent because we're doing open data, conflating the two, and we have to be really critical in keeping those apart. So we have to ask, what are the reasons for releasing data? Where's the shared interest between different advocates, and where do we have different interests? I think Paul's question is absolutely crucial of who can access and use data. Is it always mediated through a technical elite, or are we finding ways to be inclusive and transform open government with open data as part of that? But in closing, I think the point is, I think we started with that idea that this is not a politically contentious issue in Westminster. You know, there's a sense that this is the future, this is the direction we're heading. So I think the political question is not should we do open data or not, it's how we do it, and it's really paying attention to those details, data set by data set, app by app, department by department, to make sure we get something that promotes the sort of outcomes we want, not the ones we don't.
Thank you very much, Tim. Tom.
Okay. So for those of you who want to hear me but not have to look at me, if you move down here, you'll be fine. Okay? So I want to pick up on something actually that Dan Hill was saying upstairs. So on the whole notion that there's the bottom-up kind of network infrastructure with implicitly, I think, openness on the side of that, and then the top-down institutions that he was talking against. But I think the world has changed in the last 20 years. It's not the same as when Linus Torvalds started Linux. It's not the same as when open source started. At that point, I think openness played a role of being a way for people who had few resources to challenge institutions that had lots of resources. But I think the openness boot, to some extent, is now on the other foot, and I think we need to keep an eye on that. So let's just take a few examples. So if we look at, and broadening out a bit from open data, but let's take a look at the world of education, where you have new companies like Udacity and Coursera, who will go to well-funded companies. They'll go to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, and they'll proclaim that they're sort of on the side of the bottom-up disruptors, which is a very strange position to try to hold, but they seem to try to do that. Then you've got something that is called the sharing economy, which invokes all kinds of cooperative overtones and has all kinds of people-to-people, peer-to-peer senses to it. But then you have companies like Airbnb or Uber, again, very well-funded things. And who are they trying to disrupt? They're trying to disrupt city-level taxi companies, and they're trying to disrupt bed and breakfast. I mean, this is the world. This is not the world turned upside down. This is the world getting turned right back the way it was by openness. And I think open data has a danger of going down that road too. So if I can just give two examples. So in a Capgemini paper about openness recently, one of the examples they chose for innovation was Zillow, which is another American company that has used a lot of public data sets to put together real estate, it's information for householders. But one of the things they did recently was they took the information for people who are foreclosing on their houses, having not able to keep up with the mortgage payments and having to give it back to the bank. And this was one of that set of information that was formally open, but you had to go and look for it. But they managed to find a way of collecting it together, putting it out publicly. So then all of a sudden, if you were having problems financially, everyone would know about it, right? So again, I think the idea that openness is necessarily on the side of the bottom going against the top is one we kind of have to get past in today's world. I think the other side of this, of course, as everyone has said, is transparency. And if I can just say a few words from Canada on that, I think to follow up in a way what Tim was saying, Canada has a very good reputation along with the UK and a few other countries in terms of open data and the open government policy. It's put in sort of the leader quadrant of that map. But I think at the same time, domestically, the government has a very bad reputation for transparency. So it can do open data without transparency. So as an example, so Statistics Canada, or StatsCan, is the equivalent of the Office of National Statistics, and it has a budget of about $600 million. And about 100 million of that is recouping costs from selling data, right? So on the one hand, they've been told to make much more data open, but on the other hand, they've been given budget cuts. So what's the result? Well, number one, I'd like to actually just read for something that a couple of academics wrote. For many of us, it started with the census. In a controversial move, our government switched from a mandatory to a voluntary long-form census in the summer of 2010. And that was on privacy grounds, but it really messes up the information you can get from the census. The former StatsCan chief, the media and the research community reacted with shock, largely opposed this change to no avail. We have now halted the collection and analysis of our most informative longitudinal information on our labour force, on the workplace, on health and healthcare, and on child well-being. How does Canada expect to meet the policy challenges of the future when we no longer have the ability to understand where we are today? So I think we need to keep an eye on the fact that it's important, you can't measure openness in bytes in terms of how many data sets you have available. You have to look also at what's being collected and ensure that that infrastructure is there. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much to all of our panellists. Before we open it up, I just wondered if we could actually take up that last point, Paul, I thought you might want to respond to Tom on that last point, which is the point about, it's the point before last, which is the point about big companies essentially capturing open data. And because obviously the government wants to use open data to fuel the economy, that's absolutely clear. Mm-hmm. There's nothing essentially wrong with that. But this danger of, companies capturing it, using it in ways that we might not think of as for the public good. Do you see, I mean, how do you deal with that dichotomy within the Cabinet Office? It must be something you've done.
Well, I think the first thing to say that the mixture of businesses and that we know about and working in this space are really quite a large range. There's a huge amount of very small entrepreneurs setting up what could be very small niche businesses, some of which I would expect become absolutely massive. But I don't know which ones, if otherwise I'd be spending my cash, right?
Google of the future is, yeah.
But some of that is small and it's dynamic. But of course, yeah, there's big organisations using that, and sometimes it's hard to hear that back. I mean, we're making the data open, and you sort of hear stories about it rather than people coming back, because of course there's competitive advantage. So if you've got a big organisation that's reorganising its distribution networks based on a combination of our mapping data, our travel, weather, and their own data within the organisation, they're not going to be screaming about that and wanting us to put it up on data.gov.uk. But I'm not sure if I quite see where the sinister bit is in that. You also have, companies wanting open data in order to be able to help them develop as organisations in their own right. So things like trying to improve their own credit scores by trying to get access to bits of data that at the moment are locked away in HMRC and elsewhere. So you see that sort of demand for people trying to say, look, I'm one of the good guys, not one of the bad guys, and can people recognise that? So I suppose I find it a little bit hard to, it's not really the role of government to start, working out which business does what with the data, I think. Largely we see our role as making that data available in an open format and as much as we can, and trying to prioritise that according to where the use is through the open data user groups and others, but also, I suppose, to try and help spark into life, not doing it ourselves, but help spark into life some of those quite remarkable applications in the realm of making the public's life easier and their choices within a public service context, I guess.
Okay. And Tim, I just said, sorry, did you want to come back on that?
No, go ahead.
Because I was just going to move on. I just wanted to ask you a different question, which was, in your kind of opening remarks, you talked about the politics of making policy around open data. And I just wanted to ask the question, is that actually substantially any different from making policy about anything else? Because, in fact, one always has these policy tensions about, well, absolutely everything. So is it substantially different, do you think, because it's open data, or is it pretty much the same?
So I think there's two elements there. One is the domestic politics of open data in the UK. I think Paul was pointing to there has been an interesting different story because of the collaboration between technologists and government on building this initiative and building this agenda. So I think there's been an interesting case study in a way politics has been done around this initiative that's combined, and we see it in a number of other areas, but not so many, where we've got this very broad left-right political coalition with this shared interest in some particular reform. So the politics have been interesting in that perspective and slightly different. But one of the other dimensions that's been interesting is many people, because of that, trying to paint it as apolitical and put an apolitical narrative that open data is just put out there. And Paul's point that government doesn't have to care about what's built on top, I think actually is we do need to care. We don't need to pick winners or plan that too much, but we do need to think about different kinds of data sets. Some data is infrastructure. It's like the roads. We don't build roads and then say some people can't use them. Yeah. Other data sets aren't infrastructure. Other data sets are byproducts of what government's day-to-day business. And if government no longer has a public task to do something, it shouldn't be caught into continually supplying that data for a private use. Other data sets are built from our private personal data that we've trusted to government, and we've got to be very critical about government then responding to demands from companies to open that up. So we've got to differentiate these things and be making choices on each of them. and each one has different politics. One's got health politics, one's got education politics, and so on.
Lovely, thank you. So let's open it up. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you wouldn't mind just saying who you are, that would be great, where you're from. Yeah.
Hi, Anthony Townsend from the Institute for the Future. About 6 months ago, New York City passed or they adopted what I think is widely seen as the most progressive open data law, at least at the local level in the United States. And as I was looking at the statute and reading through it, I was really surprised to find a provision that excluded computer code from disclosure under that law. So basically, all the city's static data had to be disclosed, but any algorithms that were operating on that data, either to analyze it, to inform decision-making or policy-making, or to actually automate decision-making within government, were really not subject to scrutiny under that law. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists have given thought to whether this open data movement is ever going to move into surfacing some of the more kind of obscure underlying mechanisms within government that actually operate on that data to do things.
Oh, great. Who wants to tackle that one first? Dominique?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
I can. I mean, one of the things that's just come up in everybody talking is the definition of transparency, because to me that's sort of that decision-making process is all about transparency. Really means different things to different people. I think Tim and I probably agree more around what transparency means in some ways. I think it's really, really interesting because you're kind of trying to capture the functioning of government a bit more. And one thing I've seen in the US, obviously I'm American, but I've lived here for many, many years, but one thing I've seen in the US is that there are real champions within the regional, the city level that are really addressing these key issues. And it's been really, really exciting to see that. And I think we're not quite there yet in the UK. And I don't know if that has to do with the fact that a lot of the policy and a lot of the decisions, as Tim also mentioned, it's very centralized, right? So it's really London focused for, people don't really want to hear that, but it really is London focused and very much all about Westminster. So I think that's really interesting, and it's something that perhaps here in the UK, people could actually kind of start to think about a little bit more in terms of when we talk about policy, not within government when we talk about policy, but when we talk about policy in a forum like this.
So I think certainly that sense of this is a community that's starting to reach out, right? And whilst there are examples across the UK in cities, I mean, the London Data Store was there before data.gov.uk. So that there are people at that cutting edge, but I certainly see a role for, my team, and partly through things like this, is to try and nurture that spirit that actually quite amazing things can be done at a civic level as well as the sort of small entrepreneur level. Often the two collide. I thought maybe just to come back on this point around transparency sort of versus open data, and certainly, for me, I'm sort of, director of open data and the transparency that comes from it. But, so I don't do things like freedom of information policy or post-Leveson. There's a whole aspect of what a potentially open government agenda might be, and potentially that's all of government, right? So, kind of invitable chunks. But I think that certainly there's a spectrum here, and you see in the Open Government Partnership some countries sort of, quizzically raising an eyebrow when we talk about, things like bus timetables and if only we had buses, and it's like, they're at the end of, we need free and fair elections and an open press and the right to, the right to associate. And at the other spectrum, you've got countries where those things are largely taken for granted, and you're at the sort of cutting edge on the technology front. And it's not a perfect mixture between those two. I just wonder, even for those set of countries that are perhaps at the more closed end, but in terms of their processes, but very open in terms of the technology, it feels to me like there's something else going on here. Once you start to make that data available, never mind how much you try to control that, it gets out. Right? And it starts to have a repercussion back into the system, never mind how you try and control that. And even if it's just about bus timetables or whatever, it starts to change the dynamic. So I do appreciate that there is a spectrum there, and you feel it within the UK government, and I'm sure city to city, at a smaller level. But I wonder whether actually there's, once you unleash that data, actually the repercussions back into the way in which government and societies run actually just change at a fundamental level, albeit perhaps slowly.
I think we're seeing some really interesting examples in developing countries of the use of data in kind of ways that we're not even thinking about here. I mean, just some very interesting things from Mexican health clinics I can think of. And sorry, Tim.
I was going to come back on that point and just sort of, this is where the how of data really matters and how we do open data. So one of the challenges of things like data.gov.uk is they've been a firewall between the citizen and the data holder, in that you can't see who did that data set come from. Can I build a relationship with that civil servant? And one of the things from working at a local level, you often discover there's someone who spent their whole life working on a data set, working an algorithm, and they'd love someone to take an interest in it, and they'd love to have that conversation and engage with people. And actually that's a cultural change to get that to happen. So I haven't seen much of people yet calling for the code, calling for the algorithm and so on. But I think we should be thinking about how do we use existing right to information is really important to have alongside a right to data, and to say if these things are shaping our states, our societies, not only should we be sort of grabbing them off the state, but we should be engaging in a conversation with the state, calling for a cultural change that means and I've done this in a piece called The 5 Stars of Open Data Engagement, of saying, data needs to be put in context, there needs to be engagement about it. People with data sets, throw open your office doors once a month to people who use that data and have a conversation with them, and you might benefit. And then we get read-write conversations rather than that sort of grab data out.
Yeah. Tom.
If I can just respond a little too, I think I don't know a lot about where the New York City initiative is coming from, but I do think it betrays a notion of government almost as clockwork. And the more of those mechanisms you can see, the better you can understand how it works. Yeah. But I think when it comes to transparency, there's always going to be an issue here that I don't know that that's the way to go about getting transparency, right? Because there's always an issue that if you know what's being put out there, then you tailor your behavior and your expenses to deal with that. But, and what that means is if there's things you don't want people to know, then you do them some other way. You do them out of the meeting and so on. Freedom of Information Act things are more about people asking for things that when people wrote them, they didn't expect to be public. And it's that tension, I think, that leads to more transparency. I think getting at algorithms, I don't think it's a clockwork mechanism, and I don't think it will lead to a big improvement in that way.
Thanks. Lots of questions. Let's take a few and then answer them together. So, down at the front here.
Hi, Tim Hughes from Involve. I wanted to pick up on the privacy point, and it's certainly a very kind of live issue for people when you talk to them about it, and many people don't really understand the implications of open data. So the decision about what's kind of personal data and what's not is extremely political, but when you speak to people, there's no definite kind of line that people can draw between kind of personal data and everything else. So I wanted to ask about how do you think the government should make that decision? And there's certainly a difference between our activity as consumers, kind of the amount of data we give away, and our privacy standards there, with our behaviour and attitudes as citizens and what we think the government should give away. So how should the government draw that line?
Thank you. We'll just take a couple of other questions. Yeah, just here.
I'm concerned with the problem that open data is...
Could you just say you are?
Bob Barr, Open Data User Group.
Thank you.
I'm concerned with the way that open data is trying to push water uphill to some extent. From the point at which machine-readable data sets start to become available, what's tended to happen is data has tended to be enclosed. It's tended to be privatized, it's tended to be owned. In the public sector, agencies depend on revenue from data in order to be able to carry out their task. And amongst the data that's being closed, there's core reference data that makes other data usable. VAT numbers, company numbers, unique property reference numbers, the sorts of things that would make sense, for example, of local government expenditure data, which in its raw form is useless. But if you could tie it together with VAT numbers, company numbers, locations, would actually make sense. And we're struggling incredibly hard to break down those enclosures. Now, historically with land, once land was enclosed, it was very, very difficult to make it open again. And there doesn't appear to be a mechanism for doing that at the moment. There's a very entrenched data use protection or prevention industry because it depends on the revenue from that enclosed land. Now, it's not necessarily a funding issue, but I'm interested in how the panel thinks we can move that water uphill from enclosures back to data commons.
Thank you so much, and we'll just take one more and then let the panel, just behind you. Just behind you, that's it. And if you could say who you are, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Connell from Actuate. I guess we're one of these developers who are trying to do work in this area. And I'd like, the question's around business models. Because if data is being made open that I have paid for through my taxes, should I as a businessman make a profit out of that? Should the community make a profit out of that? Should the city, should the government make a profit out of that? So there's an interesting piece, and it links to about who owns data and how it's made open. And it only becomes valuable at the end of the process, not when it's sold as a data set or made open. So I just want to have some insight from you guys about how you think business models maybe should work or can work, or examples of, because we've got our own ideas, but it's a really interesting space, and it's something we should really consider, because it's not a short-term business model, this, and shouldn't be something that should be scaled very quickly, as in, it's not Angry Birds territory, this. No. It's very important. So if you could just give us an answer, what you think on that one.
So those two last questions obviously clearly linked. Paul, do you want to start us off with them?
There's another things related to that. So I think the privacy point is really important, but also interesting question, right? So what strikes me in this role that I have in government is that some of the most passionate open data advocates are also passionate pro-privacy advocates too, right? Which is kind of a conundrum, because normally in government you kind of have the people who want you to do a thing and want to stop you doing a thing, and it's like you're trying to find the right place. And I think we had the O'Hara review to try and get at the bottom of this from a policy point of view, and we've appointed privacy people onto the various transparency sector boards that are across government, and onto the transparency board in through the Cabinet Office, which are the sort of core open data bits of governance, if you like, within government. I think that some of this links into probably other conversations that are going on through this week about how, what happens when you have Google Glass, isn't it? It's just like the idea of privacy. We've thought about in quite an old-fashioned way of the government has a data set with your information on it, but actually the whole nature of that is kind of being thrown open when everything's got recordable things. Doesn't stop it being important. I think things like the My Data initiative, where you've got a sense of that the citizen has a right to the data that the state has, and you can see that in a particular way, is one interesting response to that. I think I'm going to sort of skip over Bob's very important point about the data sets that have previously been charged for. In many ways, many of those data sets, unlike the sort of exhaust data, if you like, from, the government collects anyway, and who cares, like, so where all the schools are or whatever, these are often data sets that the organisation themselves have been created to gather that data and previously been selling it. And the difficulty there is some of those data sets are the critical building blocks of this whole new industry. And so the way in which I'm going to skip over it, Bob, because I think there's some very important and powerful points in that, is to say that some of this gets at a cultural point about what this means to think about open data from a government perspective. I think there's a really big challenge to the government system, whether local or central, that data starts to present. Not least people just getting their heads around the fact that the world's moved on, and other people making uses of data that no one would ever dreamt of as a civil servant. These things, data sets that seem boring, rubbish, like not very good often, gathering virtual dust, are actually people are making use of this in ways you couldn't have foreseen. But actually, there's a cultural point here back into how do you get the insights in policy, and very much a lot of the civil service, the argument's been about trying to get an evidence-based policy approach back in. It's not just about sort of, chaps and chapasses making good judgment, but, based on what no one's quite sure. But in case, the world of big data and data itself and open data flips that around in a really significant way. So I think we'll see over the next, say, 5 years or so, open data as in some ways, as a proxy for people really starting to reevaluate how the business of government happens. And these sort of questions that Bob raises are one aspect of that. But it's just in the same way that business is thinking about this, charities, third sector organisations thinking about what this means. I think we're starting to see quite a potentially radical shift in time.
Lovely. Tom?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
You go first.
Are you sure?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was
Sorry,
just going to touch
Dominique.
upon
Go
the
on,
business
please.
models
Sure.
question.
Oh, yes, of course,
The
yeah.
last question.
Yeah.
Because on the Open Data User Group, effectively, what we've been tasked to do is to create business cases for the release of data, which is an extremely challenging and frustrating process. And as Paul has mentioned, there have been a number of studies commissioned unsuccessfully, I would say, to try to figure out, what would the revenue, specifically, what would the revenue be coming into the Treasury if we released data and how apps were made. And for me, it's just, in some ways, it's absolutely ridiculous because how do you know what you don't know, right? That kind of thing. How do you know what's going to happen with data? And again, this isn't specifically on privacy or any of the other issues, but it's been extremely challenging and extremely difficult because it relies mostly, at least we've been finding on the Open Data User Group, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, it relies mostly on anecdotes and on storytelling, which there's a lot of really great storytelling and stories to be told around opening up data. But when you're tasked effectively by the government to come up with business cases, it is picking winners, right? So we all have different opinions on the Open Data User Group about business models going forward, and I tend to be on the side of, right, well, releasing it, and however it's reused, mashed up, formulated, created, whatever that sort of thing is, will effectively add to the economy in some way, whether it's creating a whole new business or just developing an app. And so for me, I feel like that the business models that are coming out of things we just don't know yet, or I just haven't seen yet, are really just all about what people do with it, and that is different than releasing it, right? So that's a step change from that. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Tom, yeah.
If I can take up, so a couple of things that I think converge on the idea of what are the responsibilities of the consumers of open data, and I think that comes from two sides. So one is on the privacy side, of course. So I think one of the issues there, just on a technical point of view, is that there is this idea that privacy is kind of the property of a data set, personally identifiable information things, which is, I mean, it's not the right way to look at it, unfortunately. There's this notion of information entropy, that you lose your privacy a bit at a time. There's the idea of 33 bits, that if you take 7 billion people, that's 2 to the 32 and a bit. So you call it 33 bits, and every bit of information that you reveal about something narrows down the amount you do. So I think the privacy thing there can't be controlled in a fire and forget, here's the data, let it go way. It's going to end up requiring some responsibilities on the part. I mean, healthcare is the obvious thing, right? Healthcare data can go to people, but there are limits around what they can do with that data, and how you design that is going to be very complicated. And I think on the other side, in terms of business models, that comes in again. I mean, there was a session here a couple of days ago on business models for around open data, and the National Archives people were here, and they had a really interesting model around the legislation material, where they were working together with some of the educational publishers who were trying to make the legal statutes available. And they'd managed to get, because the data stays with the National Archives, they were able to get the publishers to participate in making it a better data set in terms of tracking changes in legislation and so on. And I think there's this idea of a commons, but a commons isn't a free-for-all, right? A commons is a group of people who are committed not only to using a resource, but to maintaining that resource. And I think if business models can encourage that, whether it's around transport, different ways in different data sets, I'm sure, then I think it would be a healthier outcome.
Thanks. And Tim?
Yeah, so I think to start on that data commons piece, with many of these trading funds, we've got 19th century institutions or earlier institutions that are managing our data in the ways they always have, and I think we need to both recognise that that's infrastructure data, and we've made the case in the past that government should invest in infrastructure and provide it freely for people, and we need to keep making that, because even that argument is under threat sometimes in our modern states. But also to say, what are the 21st century ways of building these data sets? What are the ways in which government can collaborate with communities in those commons, and recognise, as Tom said, that commons have governance around them, and we need good structures and we need good collaborations. I want to point to a workshop that was organised here a few months back on cooperative models for open data, and what does Manchester's history in the co-op movement have to tell us about ways we could be doing some of that governance around open data. On privacy then, really briefly, I think we shouldn't give up the principle of consent too quickly. We have principles of data protection that say data should only be used for the purposes people have consented for it to be used for, and we should go back and get consent to use it more widely, to share it more widely, and we shouldn't just say because government's got this apparent gold mine or stock of oil for its new economy sitting there doesn't mean it has the right to use it, and we've got to have either a public conversation that gets mass consent, or go back to individuals and get their consent, because that's a principle we shouldn't give up too easily.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I'm afraid that we have run out of time, although I think we could carry on talking about these things for a lot longer. So I'd like to finish just by saying that the issues we were looking at were the policies and politics of open data, and I think you'll see that these are subject to exactly the same complexities as making policies in any other area of government. There will always be tensions around this. The great thing about data, of course, is that you can use it, as Paul said, for evidence-based policy making, and it is very encouraging. I think that now in government we are seeing much more of we've got the new What Works centres, we've got much more of an idea about actually basing a lot of policies now on more open and transparent ways of doing things. So it finally remains for me to thank our panel very much indeed, and thank you. Thanks a lot.